Nobody told you it was training. The needle was just in your hand, the iron just hot, the table set a certain way. You were a girl. You didn't think of any of it as a skill. 18 things, practiced in kitchens and church basements across the whole country, passed from one pair of hands to another without being named. All of it real, all of it yours. Section 1. Hand sewing. The thimble went on the middle finger of your right hand and stayed there for the duration. Metal, small, dimpled all over its surface, so the eye of the needle had somewhere to push against without slipping. Your mother or your grandmother put it on your finger the first time, like it was the most natural thing in the world, which it was, for her. For you it felt odd, a small metal cap that changed the sensation of your fingertip and made it difficult to feel the thread you were trying to control. She told you it would stop feeling strange. She was right. Within a few sessions it felt stranger to sew without it than with it, and by the time you were 10 or 11 the thimble went on automatically, the same way you tied your shoes, without thinking about it, because that was simply how you prepared to sew. Hand sewing came before the machine in almost every household and every school that taught it. The logic was that you could not use a machine well until you understood what the machine was trying to replicate, and what it was trying to replicate was a set of specific stitches that a needle and thread in trained hands could produce with more precision and more flexibility than any mechanical device. The running stitch was first, the foundational movement, the needle going in from the top and coming out below and going back in slightly forward, weaving a line of evenly spaced dashes through the fabric at roughly 1/8 of an inch each. Even stitches, same length, same spacing. The evenness was the point, and it was harder to achieve than it sounded. Your first rows looked like something from a fever dream, long and short and erratic, a line that could not decide what it wanted to be. The woman teaching you, at home or in a classroom, said nothing except to have you do it again. The backstitch came next, and the backstitch was how you understood what the machine's straight stitch was actually doing. The needle went in behind the previous stitch and came out ahead of it, producing a continuous, unbroken line that was stronger than the running stitch and that looked from the front almost like machine work. Home economics teachers in the 1950s used that resemblance to explain why the machine existed at all, not to replace the hand, but to automate the backstitch specifically, to run it faster than any hand could manage. Girls who learned the backstitch by hand and then moved to the machine understood the machine in a way that girls who started on the machine never quite did. Simplicity Pattern Company had been founded in 1927 by Joseph Shapiro and his wife Caroline Hutchins Shapiro, one of the first credentialed home economists in American business, with patterns priced at 15 cents when first introduced. The company's stated mission was to make sewing accessible to women who had no formal training, and by the 1950s, its education department, established by Caroline Shapiro in 1934, was supplying patterns and curriculum materials directly to public schools across the country. McCall's patterns sold in the mid-1950s for 25 to 50 cents depending on complexity. Vogue patterns ran higher, $1 to $1.50, and were considered aspirational in the way that a Vogue magazine was aspirational, something you worked toward rather than started on. A girl in home economics class in 1954 was working with a simplicity pattern, not a Vogue one, and the simplicity pattern had been designed specifically so that the instructions could be followed by someone who had never made a garment before. The apron was the standard first project, flat, rectangular, 2 straight seams and a waistband. Nothing complicated, nothing requiring judgment about curves or grain lines. You made the apron and you wore it the next time something needed sewing. That was the sequence. The hem stitch was the one you used most in daily life, and it was the one most closely tied to the care of real garments in a real household. A hem that had come undone on a skirt or a dress did not go to anyone for repair. It sat in a mending basket and waited for you to take it out and fix it, and fixing it meant threading a needle and working the hemming stitch from the wrong side of the fabric, catching only 2 or 3 threads from the outer layer, with each small angled pass, so that nothing showed on the right side of the finished hem. The invisibility of a properly done hemming stitch was the test. If you could see it from the outside, you took it out and did it again. This was not perfectionism as a personality trait. This was the standard the skill required, and the standard had been the same long before you encountered it. The slip stitch was similar in purpose and slightly different in motion, used for closing an opening that had been left in a seam for turning, or for attaching one folded edge to another so the join disappeared. The overcast stitch ran along a raw edge to keep it from fraying, each stitch a small diagonal loop over the cut end of the fabric, quick and practical and unglamorous, the kind of stitch nobody ever pointed at or praised. You learned it anyway, because it was part of the vocabulary, and you were building a vocabulary, even if that word was not used for what was happening. Sewing buttons was the entry point for most girls. The simplest application of needle and thread that produced an immediately functional result. Thread doubled, knotted at the end, needle through the fabric from below, up through one hole of the button, down through the opposite hole, back through the fabric, repeated 5 or 6 times until the button was secure. A knot worked on the backside, thread snipped close. A button sewn this way did not come off. The button that came off the shirt before you learned to sew it went to whoever knew how. The button that came off after you had been taught stayed in your own hands, rethreaded and reattached inside of 10 minutes before anyone else in the house noticed it was missing. What made hand sewing genuinely difficult, and what made the teaching of it a multi-year process rather than an afternoon's instruction, was not the mechanics of any individual stitch. Each one was simple in isolation. The difficulty was the accumulation of small judgments that happened continuously during every session. How much tension to put on the thread so the fabric pulled just slightly without puckering, when the needle needed rethreading because the thread had started to fray. How to position the thimble to push without losing control of the direction. None of those judgments could be transmitted verbally in a way that transferred to the hands. They came from hours of doing it until the adjustment happened before you had consciously noticed the problem. By the mid-1970s, interest in home sewing had already begun to decline in most parts of the country as ready-made clothing became cheaper and as more women entered the workforce with less time to maintain the skill. The 1970s saw a steep drop in home sewing patterns sold by all major companies. Home economics classes were still being offered in many schools, but the emphasis was shifting. A girl who grew up in the 1950s learned hand sewing as a given, the same way she learned to read, because the assumption behind the instruction was that she would need it for the rest of her life, and that the rest of her life would include garments that required mending. That assumption was already loosening by the time she had daughters of her own. A skill that had been passed from one pair of hands to another across generations started skipping generations in the 1970s, and by the 1980s, it had become something you sought out rather than something that arrived whether you wanted it or not. The thimble is still in the sewing box somewhere, if the sewing box still exists. You know exactly what it feels like on your finger. That needle and thread were in your hand before you were 8, but there was another skill coming out of that same basket. Something that required a different tool and a different motion entirely, and without it the clothes in that household did not last the winter. Section 2. Darning. Somewhere in the house there was a wooden egg, smooth, oval, fitted with a handle or simply bare, sized to slide inside a sock and stay there while you worked on the outside of it. The darning egg was not decorative, and it was not a curiosity. Every household that maintained its clothing seriously had one, and in the 1950s that was most households, because clothing was still an investment rather than a disposable purchase, and an investment required maintenance. The egg went inside the sock. The sock stretched over its curved surface and held taut. You positioned the thin place or the hole directly over the widest part of the egg, where the surface was most taut and most smooth, and then you began. This was darning. It was what you did when a sock had worn through, which happened regularly and predictably to the heel first, then the ball of the foot, then the toe, in that order, because those were the 3 places where the shoe worked hardest against the knit. The technique was not sewing in the sense of joining 2 pieces of fabric. Darning was weaving, miniature and precise, the reconstruction of new fabric inside the boundary of a hole, using nothing except a needle and thread and the supporting surface of the egg beneath. You laid the first threads parallel across the hole in one direction, running each one slightly beyond the edge of the damaged area into the intact surrounding fabric so it had something to anchor into. These were the warp threads, the foundation. You kept them evenly spaced and at even tension, neither so loose that they would sag, nor so tight that they would pull the surrounding sock out of shape. Tension was everything, and tension was invisible until you got it wrong, at which point the finished darn puckered and bunched and created a hard ridge inside the sock that you would feel with every step. So you kept the tension right. You learned what right felt like in your hands. Then the weft went in, perpendicular to the warp, each pass of thread woven over one warp thread and under the next, alternating on each successive row so the thread interlocked rather than simply lying on top. Over, under, the needle moving across the hole one row at a time. Each row pushed gently up against the last, so the weave stayed close and even. At the end you had something that was not exactly a sock, and not exactly a patch, but was functionally both, a small piece of new fabric, grown inside the old one, from nothing except thread and patience. A well-executed darn was nearly flat against the surrounding knit and barely perceptible inside the shoe. A poorly executed one was a hard lump that blistered the heel inside of an hour. The standard was not a preference. The standard was dictated by the foot of whoever was going to wear the sock. One documentation of household habits from the early 1950s sourced from family accounts collected by textile historians, included the detail of girls and women stuffing socks with burned-out light bulbs when no darning egg was available, the glass bulb providing the same curved surface with a rougher finish that was harder to keep the needle from glancing off. The proper egg was better. Wooden ones, turned on a lathe, had been produced in America since at least the 18th century, sold through dry goods stores, and later through five and dimes like Woolworths for a few cents. By the 1950s, you could buy one at any hardware store or sewing shop for under $1. Some households had the same darning egg for 3 generations, passed along with the mending basket the same way the cast iron passed from the kitchen. The object outlasted every sock it ever repaired. Darning samplers, a tradition with documented roots in the Netherlands going back to the 18th century, were the formal pedagogical tool for teaching the skill before it became something passed down informally at home. Young girls in Dutch and British households in the 1700s and early 1800s practiced on small squares of fabric that had been deliberately cut with holes of different shapes and sizes, filling each one with precise woven repairs until the sampler was a record of what the student could do. Those samplers were kept and signed and sometimes framed, not because anyone thought darning was beautiful in the way that embroidery was beautiful, but because the skill behind a completed sampler was considered worth displaying. By the 1950s, the formal sampler tradition had largely dissolved into informal household instruction, but the underlying seriousness with which the skill was treated had not changed. A girl who could darn correctly had demonstrated something specific about her ability to manage material things, to look at something damaged and understand how to restore it through patient, methodical work. Wool socks required a slightly different thread than cotton ones, and matching the fiber to the original fabric was not optional for a darn that would wear correctly. Wool darned with cotton thread produced a patch that behaved differently from the sock around it, shrinking and stretching at different rates until the mend failed at its edges. A sewing box in a 1950s household contained darning cotton on small spools in black, white, tan, and gray, the colors that covered most sock situations, alongside wool darning yarn for the wool socks that came out in autumn and went back into the drawer in spring. A trade catalog from a major dry goods supplier in the early 1950s listed darning cotton at 5 cents per spool and darning wool at 10 cents, both sold alongside needles and thimbles as standard household consumables rather than specialty items. You bought them the way you bought dish soap. They were simply part of what the house needed. The heel wore through first because the heel took the friction of the shoe at every step, and because the sock was knitted in a specific way at the heel, with a denser stitch intended to withstand exactly that friction, and even the denser stitch eventually gave way. A sock with a thinning heel was not a sock to be discarded. A thinning heel was a sock to be darned before the thin place became a hole, because darning a thin place was faster and easier than darning a hole. And a cook who managed the household's clothing understood that catching the problem early was itself part of the skill. You checked the heels the way you checked the pantry. You did not wait until something was empty to attend to it. The decline of darning as a universal household practice came gradually through the late 1950s and into the 1960s, driven by two converging forces. Nylon socks, which had become widely available after World War II, when nylon was released from military use back into consumer markets, were cheaper than wool socks and wore somewhat differently, and the mass production of hosiery meant that the price of a new pair was dropping relative to the time required to repair an old one. Nylon could be darned, but it was harder to do well, the synthetic fiber behaving less cooperatively under the needle than wool. By the mid-1960s, the economic argument for darning a pair of socks had weakened enough in most households that the darning egg began its slow migration to the back of the sewing box. Still there, still smooth, still useful, used less and less until it stopped being used entirely. The skill did not disappear. It just stopped being the automatic response to a hole in a sock. A generation learned it thoroughly and passed it along partially, and the generation after that received only pieces of it, or none. The egg is still in the sewing basket if you know where to look. You know what to do with it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That darning egg held the sock steady through repairs that kept shoes comfortable for years. There was another weekly task waiting in that same household, one that required heat and a different kind of patience, and that turned the whole pile of wrinkled laundry back into something a family could wear in public. Section 3. Ironing Tuesday was ironing day in most households, though the specific day varied by family and changed nothing about the obligation. Monday was wash day, the clothes going through the wringer washer or the new automatic and then out onto the line in all weather that allowed it. By Tuesday, the dried clothes had come in off the line stiff with sunshine and needing to be pressed back into wearing shape, and the ironing board came out from wherever it lived in that house, set up in the kitchen or the living room, and the iron went onto the board to heat, and the pile of wrinkled cotton waiting in the basket was the morning's work. You understood by age 9 or 10 that the pile did not get smaller by itself. You understood that someone had to stand at that board and work through it item by item, and that the someone in that household eventually included you. Before the ironing started, there was the sprinkling. This was the step that no one who did not grow up with it ever quite believed, and the step that anyone who did grow up with it remembered with complete physical specificity. The clothes came in dry from the line, and dry cotton did not iron well, the fibers too rigid to relax fully under the heat of the iron, without moisture to help them release. So the sprinkling bottle came out. In most households, it was a repurposed soda bottle fitted with a metal or rubber sprinkler cap that broke the water into a fine, even mist. The same cap sold at 5 and dimes and hardware stores for pennies, and pushed directly into the neck of any standard bottle. Many families used an old 7-Up bottle specifically, its heavy green glass weighted well, and its narrow neck holding the sprinkler cap securely. You shook the bottle over each piece of clothing in a light pass, not soaking it but dampening it evenly across the surface, then rolled the dampened piece into a tight cylinder to let the moisture distribute through the fabric for an hour or more before the iron touched it. Some households put the rolled pieces in the refrigerator to keep them from going sour if they would not be ironed until later. By the time the ironing began, the cotton was damp all the way through, and the iron could do what the iron was meant to do. The steam and dry combination iron, which built the water reservoir directly into the appliance and rendered the sprinkling bottle largely obsolete, was introduced to the American consumer market during the 1950s. The first commercially available electric steam iron had been introduced in 1926 by the Eldeck Company of New York, but it had not caught on, and the Steam-O-Matic Corporation, which held the exclusive manufacturing rights from 1938, sold its model for $10 and established the technology as viable before the major appliance companies moved in. By the mid-1950s, combination steam and dry irons from General Electric and Sunbeam were appearing in American kitchens, and the sprinkler bottle began its slow retirement. But the transition was gradual and uneven. Plenty of households continued sprinkling through the late 1950s and into the early 1960s out of habit, or because the new steam iron was an expense that had not been prioritized yet, or because experienced ironers found, as many noted, that fabric dampened the old way, and pressed with a dry iron came out smoother than anything the steam iron produced. The preference was not nostalgia. It was the result of comparing two outcomes with the same pair of hands. What made ironing a skill rather than simply a chore was the knowledge of temperature and fabric that the skill required. The dial on the iron's handle ran from low to high, with fabric names or dot markings between, and the sequence was fixed by physics rather than preference. Synthetics at the lowest setting, because acetate and nylon began to distort or melt at temperatures well below what cotton required. Silk and wool in the middle range, both needing heat enough to smooth the fibers but not so much that the surface scorched or developed the permanent shiny marks that ruined dark wool permanently. Cotton at the high end, the most common fabric in that household's laundry pile, requiring genuine heat to release the wrinkles that set into it during drying. Linen higher still, tolerating temperatures up to 445 degrees Fahrenheit before it complained. You learned this sequence not by reading a chart but by making the mistake that taught it. A girl who put a hot cotton iron on her sister's acetate blouse and watched the fabric bubble and distort did not make that error again. The iron remembered nothing, the girl remembered everything. The pressing cloth was the tool that protected fabrics from direct contact with the iron's hot sole plate, a square of clean white cotton or muslin laid over the garment being pressed, the iron moving across the cloth rather than the garment itself. Wool required it. Dark fabrics of any kind benefited from it. A garment ironed on its wrong side achieved the same result when the fabric was light enough. The pressing cloth was not always explained. It was demonstrated, placed over the garment by the woman who knew why it was there, and you watched and understood by watching that the cloth was the reason the garment came out of the session looking the same as it went in. Shirt collars were ironed from the collar points inward toward the back, because ironing from the center outward pushed small wrinkles toward the tips and left creases at the corners that could not be undone. Shirt sleeves were pressed along one seam fold to create a single sharp crease down the length. Trousers required a crease down the front of each leg, ironed in with firm pressure and a slightly damp pressing cloth until the fold was sharp enough to hold through a full day of wearing. Handkerchiefs were pressed flat and folded to a square. Pillowcases were done on both sides. Flat sheets were folded as they were ironed, so that the finished piece came off the board already in the shape it would be stored in, which meant ironing and folding was one motion rather than two. All of this was knowledge accumulated through repetition, and repetition began young, with the simplest pieces, the handkerchiefs and the pillowcases, before the more demanding work of shirts and trousers came within reach. What ironing produced was visible, and its absence was equally visible. Wrinkled clothes on a child going to school in the 1950s were not a neutral observation. They communicated something specific about the household, and the household knew it. The pile in the basket was worked through every week because the alternative was a statement nobody in that house wanted to make. A girl who learned to iron learned something about the relationship between sustained effort and presentation, between invisible work done regularly and the appearance of things being in order. The iron went back to its stand after the last piece. The board folded up and went back to its place. The basket was empty. Nobody commented on it. That was simply how Tuesday worked. That ironing board folded up at the end of Tuesday, and the basket was always empty by the time it did. But the next skill on this list had nothing to do with clothing or mending. It was about the table, specifically the way the table was set before anyone sat down at it, and the rules behind that setting were more precise than most people who grew up with them ever realized. Section 4. Setting a formal table. Before anyone came to dinner, before the food left the kitchen and before the chairs were pulled out, the table had already been worked on. You had been the one to work on it. Not because you volunteered, and not because it was assigned to you on a rotating chart, because you were old enough to do it correctly, and in that household doing it correctly was understood to mean doing it the same way every time, with the same precision and in the same order, regardless of whether company was coming or whether it was a Thursday evening with only the family at home. The standard did not change based on audience. That was the whole point of the standard. The plate went down first, centered in front of the chair, pulled back exactly 1 inch from the edge of the table. 1 inch was not approximate. 1 inch was the rule, its purpose being that a place setting set too close to the edge crowded the diner's lap and looked careless, and one set too far back left dead space between the person and their food and looked worse. You learned to judge the inch by feel, the pad of your finger used as a gauge, the tip of a finger measuring the gap between the plate's edge and the table's edge, with a consistency that became automatic after enough repetitions. In households with a tablecloth, this was easier. On a bare wood table, the uniformity across all the place settings was its own kind of proof of whether the person setting the table had been paying attention. The fork went to the left of the plate, the dinner knife went to the right, blade turned inward toward the plate. This inward turn of the blade was not a quirk of any particular household. It traced to a convention several centuries old, rooted in the social logic that a knife blade turned outward toward a guest was a gesture of aggression, however unconscious, and that a knife blade turned inward was its opposite. By the 1950s, the reasoning behind the rule had largely been forgotten in most kitchens, but the rule itself had not, and a knife set with its blade facing outward was noticed and corrected the same way a misspelled word was noticed and corrected, as a small error that said something about the attention brought to the task. The spoon went to the right of the knife. In that sequence, fork, plate, knife, spoon, reading left to right, was everything a person needed to eat a full meal at a family table. And that sequence was the foundation upon which everything more complicated was built. The water glass went above the knife, directly above the tip of the blade, at a slight diagonal to the right, not above the spoon, not at the center of the setting, above the knife specifically, and the specificity was not arbitrary. The placement allowed the right hand to reach the glass without crossing over the knife, which would have required lifting the arm across the setting and disturbed the arrangement. The logic of table setting in the 1950s was always ergonomic at its root, each element placed where the body could reach it most naturally during the course of the meal. Understanding that logic made it easier to remember the rules, because the rules were not arbitrary once you understood why they existed. The bread plate, when one was used, went upper left, above the forks, with the small butter spreader laid diagonally across its surface, handle pointing to the right, blade facing downward. The mnemonic for remembering which bread plate belonged to which diner at a shared table was BMW. Bread on the left, meal in the middle, water on the right. A device that appeared in etiquette instruction through the mid-20th century, and that solved one of the most consistent sources of confusion at a multi-person table. The person who reached for their neighbor's bread plate rather than their own created a small disruption that the neighbor then had to navigate gracefully, and the graceful navigation of such disruptions was itself a skill the table setting was designed to prevent the need for. Emily Post had published the first edition of her book, simply titled Etiquette, in 1922, and by the 1950 edition, she was writing for a country that had changed considerably from the one she had first addressed. Post acknowledged in her 1950 edition that the walls dividing society by class had come down, and her revised guidance reflected a belief that good manners belonged to everyone, rather than to a particular social stratum. Her book went through multiple editions, and was found on the shelves of households that had no servants and no formal dining room. bought not for its relevance to debutante balls, but for its relevance to the weekly dinner table and the occasional guest. The rules post-codified for fork placement and knife direction and glass position were the same rules home economics teachers taught in classrooms across the country, and the same rules a mother passed to her daughter while standing on the other side of the table during the setup, correcting the knife that faced the wrong direction with a quiet gesture rather than an explanation. The napkin was folded and placed either to the left of the fork or on the plate itself, in a simple rectangle or triangle. For a company dinner, it might be folded into a more elaborate shape, a fan or a bishop's hat, creased between both hands, and opened into its form and stood upright on the plate where the guest would find it. The bishop's hat fold required a square napkin starched to crispness, folded diagonally into a triangle, the two bottom corners folded up to meet the top point, the whole thing flipped over and the bottom folded up twice, then the sides tucked into each other, and the crown opened with a finger inserted at the top. A girl who could produce a standing bishop's hat from a linen napkin had been practicing, because the folds had to be pressed firmly enough that the structure held its shape until the guest sat down and shook it open onto their lap. The shake was the moment. The napkin unfolded, and the table setting became a meal. The complete formal place setting with salad fork, fish knife, soup spoon, and dessert utensils placed horizontally above the plate in opposing directions, fork handle pointing left and spoon handle pointing right, was taught in home economics class as a full system to be understood, even if the household never used all of it at once. The principle behind the full formal setting was the same as the principle behind the basic one. Utensils appeared on the table in the order they would be used, working from the outside in, so that a diner who had never sat at that particular table before could navigate every course correctly simply by following the arrangement from its outermost edge toward the plate. The table communicated the meal sequence before the food arrived. A girl who understood that principle could set any table she would ever encounter. What a correctly set table did for the people who sat down at it was harder to name than the placement rules themselves. It organized the beginning of the meal. It said that the meal was worth preparing for, that the people eating it were worth the preparation, and that the household understood the difference between eating and dining. That distinction sounds formal stated plainly. At the table it was simply there, in the 1-inch gap between the plate and the edge, in the knife blade turned inward, in the glass placed exactly where the reaching hand would find it. Nobody announced it. The table announced it for them. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That table was set the same way every time, and the precision behind it was a form of respect that didn't need explaining. The next skill on this list was quieter than any of this, and required no tools at all, only a pen, a piece of paper, and the knowledge of exactly what to say and how to say it.
Section 5. Writing thank you notes.
The note had to go out within 24 to 48 hours. That was the rule as it was understood in the 1950s, stated plainly in etiquette books, and reinforced at home by mothers who had been told the same thing by their mothers, and who took the timing seriously enough that a thank you note sent on the third day after a birthday party was already late and was recognized as late by the person receiving it. The window was not wide and it was not approximate. You received the gift or attended the dinner or stayed the night at someone's house, and the note went out promptly, because a prompt note said one thing and a delayed note said something else entirely, and both messages arrived whether you intended them to or not. The stationery mattered before the words did. A girl in a 1950s American household had her own notepaper, chosen with her in mind, sized for a young person's correspondence, and distinct from her mother's. Crane & Co., which had been manufacturing paper products in Dalton, Massachusetts, since 1801 and supplying the United States government with cotton fiber for currency paper throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, produced correspondence cards and note sheets that appeared on the shelves of stationery stores and drugstores across the country. A box of note cards with matching envelopes, purchased at a 5 and dime for under $1 or at a proper stationery shop for somewhat more, was a standard birthday or Christmas gift for a girl between 8 and 12, and its purpose was not decorative. The box was to be used. The note cards went out one by one over the following year, and when the box was empty it was replenished, and the writing continued. Plain white or cream-colored paper was correct for most correspondence. Pale blue and pale pink were acceptable for informal notes, particularly for younger girls. Black-bordered paper was reserved for mourning and was not used for other purposes. The envelope was addressed in dark ink, blue or black, in handwriting legible enough that the postal carrier could read it at a glance. The return address went on the back flap or the upper left corner of the front. A first-class stamp in 1950 cost 3 cents. In 1958, it rose to 4 cents. The note cost very little to send, and its absence cost considerably more in social terms than its price in postage. The structure of the note was fixed and short, 3 to 4 sentences, handwritten, covering 4 specific things in a specific order. First, name the gift or occasion precisely. A generic opening that thanks someone for the lovely gift, without saying what the gift was, told the recipient 2 things: that the writer had sent the same note to everyone without individualizing any of them, and that the gift had not made enough impression to be remembered. Both conclusions reflected poorly on the writer. A note that opened with "Thank you for the blue cardigan sweater," or "Thank you for the beautiful silver bookmark," or "Thank you for having me to dinner on Saturday," named the specific thing and closed the first possibility immediately. The gift existed in the note. That was the baseline. Second, say something true and particular about the gift or the occasion. This was the sentence most girls found hardest to write, because it required genuine observation rather than formula. A gift given by a grandmother who had driven 40 minutes to attend a birthday party deserved a sentence that acknowledged both the distance and the affection behind it. A useful gift deserved a line about how it would be used. A gift of money, which etiquette of the period specified, should never be referred to as cash or money in the note itself, was acknowledged through an indication of its intended purpose. Something like "It will help me save toward a new bicycle," or "I plan to put it toward the dress I have been hoping for." The note never mentioned the amount. It acknowledged the generosity and implied its effect. Third, reference the relationship or the occasion in a way that connected the present moment to a shared past or anticipated future. Something like, "I always enjoy our time together," or "I hope we will see each other at Christmas," or "Your kindness means a great deal to our whole family." This sentence was the one that distinguished a note from a receipt. A receipt confirmed that something had been received. A note said that the person who gave the thing and the person who received it were connected in a way that outlasted the exchange, and this sentence was where that connection was named. Fourth, close with a brief reiteration of thanks. Sign the note with your full name if writing to someone outside the immediate family, and put the note into its envelope before setting it down, because a note that was finished but not sealed and addressed had a way of staying on the desk until it was too late to send without apology. The sealing was the final step of the writing and had to happen in the same sitting. The instruction not to begin a thank you note with the word "I" was a specific and firm piece of period etiquette, traceable through multiple mid-century manner guides, based on the reasoning that a thank you note was not about the writer but about the recipient, and opening with "I" oriented the note in the wrong direction before the first sentence was complete. A note that opened with "Thank you so much for" rather than "I really loved" began in the right place. The distinction was subtle enough to be invisible to most readers, but it shaped the entire tone of what followed, and girls who learned the rule absorbed it completely enough that a note beginning with "I read" as slightly off, even if the writer could not have said precisely why. Emily Post wrote in her 1950 edition of Etiquette that handwriting a note, however imperfect the penmanship, carried a sincerity that no printed card and no verbal thanks could replicate, because it required the writer to slow down and commit their attention to a single person for the duration of a page. The attention itself was the gift inside the gift, and the recipient recognized it. This was not sentiment but observation. A handwritten note took 5 to 10 minutes to compose and address and stamp. The act of spending those minutes said something that a spoken thank you, in the moment of receiving, sincere as it might be, did not say and could not replace. The 1950s understood this not as an optional nicety, but as an obligation, and the obligation fell specifically and consistently to girls, who were taught to write notes the way they were taught to set the table, because these things maintained the connective tissue of the household's social world, and the household's social world was understood to be their domain to maintain. The box of note cards lived in the desk drawer. When a gift arrived or a visit ended, you went to the drawer. You wrote the note before you did anything else, because that was simply the order of things. That note was in the mail within 48 hours, and the person who received it knew exactly what the timing meant. But while the correspondence went out through the front door, the next skill on this list was practiced in the kitchen, and it was one of the most technical things a girl in that decade was expected to master before she was old enough to drive. Section 6. Home canning summer was when it happened, and summer was when it had to happen, because the produce in the garden, or from the farm stand, or the bushel basket, carried home from the market was not going to wait. Tomatoes ripened all at once whether you were ready or not. Green beans came in before you had finished the previous batch. Peaches arrived in a window of 2 weeks in August, and then they were gone until the following year. The kitchen in a house where canning was done ran hot in July and August in a way that it did not run during the rest of the year, the large pot on the back burner maintaining a rolling boil for hours, while the jars went in and came out, and more jars went in. and the counter filled with filled jars cooling in rows, and the whole room smelled of whatever was being processed that day. Tomatoes or beans or peaches or corn. The steam carrying the smell of the garden into every corner of the house. You were in that kitchen. You were helping. By the time you were 10 or 11, you were doing parts of it yourself, and by 12, the steps were yours to execute without being directed. The Ball Blue Book Guide to Home Canning had been in American kitchens since 1909, when the Ball brothers, who had moved their glass jar manufacturing operation to Muncie, Indiana, in 1887, first published it under the title, The Correct Method for Preserving Fruit. The book grew with each edition, absorbing new safety research and expanding its recipe library, and by the 1950s, the edition sitting on the kitchen shelf, its spine softened and its pages stained from years of use, was the primary reference document for home food preservation in millions of American households. It cost a few cents at the hardware store, where the jars were also sold. A ready reference chart from the Ball Corporation, produced in the early 1950s and sold alongside the Blue Book, hung on the inside of a cabinet door in many canning kitchens, listing processing times by food type and jar size in a grid small enough to read at a glance while both hands were occupied. The distinction between water bath canning and pressure canning was the first technical thing you learned, and getting it wrong was not a small matter. Water bath canning processed food in jars submerged in boiling water at 212 degrees Fahrenheit, and that temperature was sufficient for high-acid foods, fruits, tomatoes, pickles, jams, and jellies, because the acidity of those foods created an environment hostile to the bacterium Clostridium botulinum, which caused botulism. Low-acid foods, green beans, corn, carrots, meat, produced no such environment, and botulinum spores could survive the boiling water temperature entirely. The spores required 240 degrees Fahrenheit to be destroyed, a temperature only achievable under pressure, which meant that low-acid foods had to go into the pressure canner. This was not a preference or a school of thought. It was chemistry, and the chemistry had consequences. The United States Department of Agriculture had formally established pressure canning as the only safe method for low-acid foods in 1917. By the 1950s, every serious canning kitchen had a pressure canner alongside the water bath pot, and a girl learning to can learned which foods went into which vessel before she learned anything else. The jars were Ball or Kerr or Mason, the three-part name that meant Mason-type jar in common household vocabulary, regardless of which brand was in the cabinet. The two-piece lid system, a flat disc with sealing compound around its outer rim, and a separate metal screw band to hold it in place, was the standard by the 1950s. The flat lid was used only once, its sealing compound compressed during processing and designed to create a vacuum as the jar cooled. The screw band could be reused. Before filling, the jars were washed in hot soapy water and heated to prevent thermal shock when the hot food went in. The lids were washed and set aside. The food was prepared, cooked if the recipe required it, and packed into the jars either raw or hot depending on the method, with specific attention to headspace, the gap between the surface of the food and the rim of the jar, which had to match the recipe exactly because the headspace determined how the vacuum formed during processing. Too little headspace and the food expanded into the lid and broke the seal. Too much, and the air left in the jar affected the final product. 1/8 of an inch for jams, 1/4 inch for most fruits, 1/2 inch for most vegetables. You measured with the headspace tool, a flat notched instrument included in the canning kit, or you learned to judge by eye after enough batches. After filling, the rim of each jar was wiped clean with a damp cloth, because a single particle of food on the rim could prevent the lid from sealing. The lid went on. The band went on fingertip tight, which meant tightened by hand until it met resistance, and then stopped, not cranked down with full force, because over-tightening trapped air inside the jar and interfered with the sealing process. The jars went into the canner in the rack, covered by 1 to 2 inches of water. The lid went on the pot, and the timing began when the water returned to a full rolling boil. Processing times ran from 5 minutes for some jams to 45 minutes or more for tomatoes packed in quart jars, and the timing was not flexible. You set the clock and you watched it. When the processing time ended, the pot came off the heat and the lid came off, and the jars sat in the water for 5 minutes before coming out. The jar lifter, a handled gripping tool that kept your hands clear of the boiling water, went around the neck of each jar and lifted it onto a folded towel on the counter, where the jars were set an inch apart to allow air circulation. You did not tighten the bands. You did not tip the jars. You left them undisturbed for 12 to 24 hours and you listened. Within the first 30 minutes, as the jars cooled and the vacuum formed inside, the flat lid was pulled downward by the dropping pressure and produced a sharp metallic sound, a ping, that was the confirmation you had been waiting for. Each jar that pinged was sealed. A jar that did not ping within the cooling period was refrigerated and used within 2 weeks. You pressed the center of each cooled lid to confirm the seal. A properly sealed lid was rigid and did not flex. One that moved up and down under your finger had not sealed and was not stored. The filled jars went to the cellar or a cool dark cabinet, labeled in pencil or marker with the contents and the date, and they stayed there until winter. Opening a jar of tomatoes in January that you had put up the previous August was not a small satisfaction. The color and the smell that came out of that jar when the lid broke its seal were the proof that the work in July had been done correctly, that the temperatures had been right, and the timing had been right, and the headspace had been right, and the rim had been clean. All of it invisible in the final product. All of it present in the fact that the jar had made it to January without spoiling. Canning declined as a widespread household skill through the late 1950s and into the 1960s, for the same reasons that most kitchen labor-intensive practices declined. Commercial canned goods were cheap, freezers became common in American homes, and the time required for a full day of canning was time that employed women no longer had in the same quantity. By 1970, it was already becoming a choice rather than a necessity for most households. A girl who had learned it in 1952 from her mother and her grandmother had learned something that her own daughter in 1972 might never be shown. Not because the knowledge had been lost, but because the structure of daily life had shifted enough that the kitchen no longer ran hot in August the same way. The ping of a ceiling lid is a sound you recognize immediately if you ever heard it in that kitchen. You know exactly what it meant. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Those jars went onto the shelf sealed and labeled, and the kitchen cooled down finally after a long August day. But the next skill on this list had nothing to do with preservation or the garden. It was quieter than any of this, practiced in a chair by a window, and the object it produced was something every person in that household wore. Section 7. Knitting. The needles made a sound that was specific to themselves and to nothing else. 2 lightweight sticks, aluminum or bone or plastic, clicking against each other at the point where the stitches transferred from one to the other. A soft, quick percussion that had no equivalent in any other domestic activity. In a room where someone was knitting, that sound was simply there. A background to conversation or to the radio or to silence. Continuous and unhurried. And you did not consciously register it unless it stopped. When it stopped, you looked up. When it started again, you looked back down at whatever you had been doing. The sound was the signal that everything in the room was in order. A girl learned to knit from whoever in the household knew how, or from a neighbor, or from a teacher, or from the woman at the yarn counter of the 5 and dime who offered free lessons with the purchase of a skein. A practice common enough through the 1950s that it was noted in trade publications of the era as a standard retail strategy for yarn shops and department store yarn departments. The lesson was short because knitting, at its foundation, contained only 2 movements. The knit stitch and the purl stitch were the entire vocabulary of the craft. Every pattern that had ever been written, from a simple rectangle to a sweater with cables and shaping, was built from combinations of those 2 stitches in different sequences and different arrangements. The 1958 World Book Encyclopedia noted this plainly in its entry on knitting, describing the craft as one where there were only 2 main stitches, and the rest depended entirely on practice. That was accurate. What the encyclopedia did not say was that the gap between knowing 2 stitches and knowing how to use them was measured not in lessons, but in hours of repetition, and that the repetition was where the skill actually lived. Casting on came first, and was the threshold the beginner had to cross before any real knitting could begin. A slip knot on the needle. The yarn looped and pulled through in the specific motion that produced a new stitch on the needle's shaft. The process repeated until the right number of stitches sat in a row, each one a small loop waiting to be worked. The number of stitches you cast on determined the width of whatever you were making, and the width was fixed from the first row forward, unless you added or removed stitches deliberately, which was a technique that came later, after the basics were settled. A girl learning to knit cast on more stitches than she needed, and fewer than she needed, and the wrong number and indeterminate count of times before she could reliably produce what the pattern called for. The counting was part of the discipline. Every 10th stitch was a landmark, tracked by touch if the work was going well, and if the count came out wrong at the end of a row, the source of the error had to be found before the next row started, because an error left in place grew into a problem that could not be solved without undoing work that had already been completed. The knit stitch and the purl stitch were physical mirror images of each other, the needle entering the existing stitch from a different direction in each case, the yarn wrapping from a different position, the resulting loop sitting on the needle with its legs twisted in the opposite orientation. All knit stitches produced garter stitch, ridged and elastic, and the same on both sides. The fabric of scarves and dishcloths and the most basic projects. Alternating knit rows and purl rows produced stockinette, the smooth, flat fabric that appeared in sweaters and most commercial knitted garments, with a right side of smooth V-shaped stitches and a wrong side of horizontal ridges. Learning which side of stockinette was which, and keeping track of which stitch belonged to which row when the work was turned at the end of a row and the right and wrong sides exchanged positions in the hands, was a judgment that came from practice rather than instruction. You looked at the fabric and you knew which side was facing you, and you made the correct stitch. For a while you did not always know. Then you always knew. The scarf was the first project for the same reason it had always been the first project, and remained the first project for anyone who learns to knit at any point in any decade. It was a rectangle. Length and width and nothing else. No shaping, no increasing or decreasing, no seaming, no assembly. You cast on, you worked until it was long enough, you bound off, you wove in the two ends, and you had a scarf. The cast on and the bind off were the bookends of every piece of knitting, and both required slightly different technique from the rows in between. The bind off in particular, a sequence of slipping one finished stitch over the next along the needle's length, each stitch locked against the one before it in a chain that produced the finished edge. A bind off too tight left an edge that curled and pulled and was uncomfortable against the skin. A bind off too loose produced a floppy edge that did not hold its shape. The correct tension was a moving target that each knitter calibrated to her own hands over time, and the scarf was where that calibration began. Wool was the standard fiber for knitting in America through the first half of the 1950s, warm and elastic and forgiving of imperfect tension in a way that would absorb small inconsistencies and produce a relatively uniform fabric anyway. Following World War II, the introduction of affordable synthetic yarns changed what was available at the yarn counter. Orlan, the acrylic fiber DuPont introduced in the early 1950s and marketed as a wool substitute, was machine washable and less expensive per skein than wool, and its adoption into the mainstream yarn market widened the options available to a beginning knitter working with a limited budget. A skein of standard wool in the mid-1950s ran roughly 50 to 75 cents depending on the weight and the brand. Orlan and similar acrylics undercut that price and required no special handling. The trade-off was in feel and behavior, the synthetic fiber less elastic than wool, its stitches less forgiving of variations in tension, its finished fabric less warm. A girl who had learned on wool and then switched to acrylic noticed the difference in her hands immediately. Tension was the invisible skill behind everything the needles produced. Two knitters working from the same pattern with the same yarn and the same needle size could produce finished objects of noticeably different dimensions if their tension, the consistent tightness with which each stitch was drawn onto the needle, differed between them. This was the reason that knitting patterns specified a gauge, a measurement of how many stitches should appear in a given inch of fabric, when the pattern's recommended needle size was used at the correct tension. A girl who knitted tightly had to move to a larger needle to match the gauge. A girl who knitted loosely needed a smaller one. The gauge swatch was the test, a small square of the pattern's stitch knitted before the project started, measured against the gauge specification, and used to determine whether adjustments were needed before committing to the full piece. Most beginning knitters skipped the swatch. Most beginning knitters also ended up with a scarf that was not the width they had planned. What knitting produced that the other skills on this list did not was a particular quality of patience, portable and interruptible. Something that could be set down in the middle of a row and picked up again without losing its place in any way that mattered. The work waited. You came back to it when you had time, and you took it up again where you left it. The needles clicked. The scarf grew by slow fractions of an inch with each row, invisible in the moment and visible only over the span of days, and eventually it was long enough, and the bind-off ran along the final row, and the ends were woven in, and the thing that had been yarn was now a scarf, made by your hands from 2 stitches, and enough time. Those needles clicked all through the house and stopped when they were supposed to stop. But the next skill on this list had nothing to do with making anything at all. It was about maintaining something, specifically the one room in the house that was expected to look a certain way every single morning, no matter what the night before had required. Section 8. Making a bed. Every morning before anything else happened, before breakfast and before school and before whatever the day required, the bed had to be made. This was not a suggestion, and it was not a preference, and it was not a rule that had been recently established. It was simply the condition of mornings in a household that maintained itself, and a girl living in that household understood from an early enough age that the condition applied to her bed the same way it applied to every other bed in the house. The unmade bed was not a neutral thing. An unmade bed in a 1950s American household communicated something specific about the person who slept in it and the household that permitted it, and neither of those communications was favorable. You made the bed. That was how the morning started. What made it a skill rather than simply a habit was the standard the making was held to, and the standard was specific enough to require learning. 2 flat sheets, a wool blanket or 2 depending on the season, and a bedspread or coverlet on top. In the early 1950s, the fitted sheet did not yet exist in any practical form. Bertha Berman, an inventor from Forest Hills, New York, filed the patent application for her fitted bedsheet design in 1957, and the patent was granted on October 6, 1959, but her early design relied on elastic garters at the corners that frequently pulled free, and most American households through the first half of the decade continued using 2 flat sheets and the corner tucking technique that had preceded the fitted sheet by generations. Even after Berman's patent and the gradual introduction of fitted bottom sheets into the market, many households stayed with the flat sheet system out of preference or habit well into the early 1960s. The flat sheet required more skill at the corners, and the skill required at the corners was the thing that distinguished a made bed from a properly made bed. Hospital corners were the technique, named for their use in medical settings where beds needed to be made tightly enough that sheets stayed in place through patient movement and through the frequent bed checks that hospital nursing required. The military had adopted the same technique, and the returning veterans of World War II and the Korean War had brought the standard home with them, so that by the 1950s, the hospital corner carried 2 kinds of authority simultaneously, the medical and the military, both institutions in which a loosely made bed was an error with consequences. The technique itself was a sequence of 4 movements at each corner of the bed. Tuck the sheet straight down under the foot of the mattress, lift the hanging side of the sheet at a 45-degree angle, and lay it across the surface of the bed like a folded triangle. Tuck the lower hanging portion under the mattress, then fold the angled portion back down and tuck it smoothly under as well. The result was a flat, mitered corner with no loose fabric and no sagging. The sheet drawn taut enough that the surface was smooth all the way from foot to head. A coin dropped onto a bed made this way in a military barracks was expected to bounce. The standard in a 1950s household was not quite that precise, but the expectation of a tight, unwrinkled surface was real, and it was inspected. The bottom sheet went on first, pulled across the mattress without wrinkles, and tucked under on all 4 sides with hospital corners at each foot. Then the top sheet went on right side down, so that when it was folded back at the head of the bed, the right side would face up, the sheet placed so that its top edge aligned with the top of the mattress, and enough fabric hung over the foot and both sides to make proper tucks. The blanket went over the top sheet, aligned a few inches below the top of the sheet, so that the sheet could be folded down over the blanket's edge when the bed was finished, producing the folded back cuff at the top that was the visual signature of a made bed in that decade. Both the top sheet and the blanket were tucked under the foot of the mattress together with hospital corners, then tucked along both sides, drawn smooth and flat. The bedspread or coverlet went over everything last, smoothed down from the head, tucked under the pillows or folded back over them depending on the household's preference, its edges hanging evenly on both sides. The pillows went on top, and their placement was the finishing statement. A pillow simply dropped onto a made bed announced that the bed had been made in a hurry. A pillow set square against the headboard, its case opening facing inward toward the center so the gap was hidden, its surface smoothed flat from edge to edge, announced that the bed had been made with attention. Some households folded the bedspread back over the front of the pillows. Some propped the pillows against the headboard and smoothed the bedspread up behind them. Either method produced the same result when done carefully: a bedroom that looked like it was not in use, that had returned to a state of readiness for the next night. That readiness was the point. The room looked like it was waiting, not like it had just been abandoned. The wool blankets used in most American households through the 1950s laundered differently from cotton sheets, requiring either dry cleaning or careful hand washing in cool water to prevent shrinking, and in many homes they were not washed every week, the way the sheets were, but were aired instead, carried outside and hung on the clothesline in fine weather to breathe, the outdoor air serving as the cleaning agent for the fibers that water would have damaged. The sheets went into the wash on Mondays, as they always had. The blankets went outside when the weather permitted. The bedspread was treated as its own category, shaken and smoothed daily and laundered separately, less frequently, with whatever level of care its material required. Cotton bedspreads could be washed with the sheets. Candlewick bedspreads, with their tufted chenille surface that had been popular since the 1930s and remained so through the 1950s, required gentler handling and specific drying to keep the tufts from matting. What the made bed did for the room around it was outsized relative to the time it took. A room in which the bed was made was a room that looked under control, regardless of anything else going on in it. The dresser might hold this morning's choices, and last night's book might be on the nightstand, and the closet door might be standing open. And none of those things registered as disorder, the way an unmade bed registered as disorder. The made bed was the condition on which everything else in the room was evaluated. A girl who understood this had understood something about the relationship between visible order and the invisible effort required to maintain it, and about which effort the household considered non-negotiable. The bed was made in the morning because leaving it unmade was not an option anyone in that house had considered. That was simply how the mornings worked. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That bed was made every morning before the day started, and the room looked right because of it. But the next skill on this list moved out of the bedroom entirely and into a responsibility that came with its own small income, its own weight of accountability, and a front door that opened onto a situation your parents were not present to supervise. Section 9. Babysitting. The parents left a phone number on the pad by the kitchen phone and a time when they expected to be home, and then the door closed behind them and the house was yours. Not yours in the way that your own house was yours, but yours in the more immediate and more demanding sense, that everything that happened in it for the next 4 hours was your responsibility, and there was no one else in the building with the authority or the experience to handle it if something went wrong. The children were there, the smallest one already in pajamas, the older one still negotiating the terms of bedtime in a way that was entirely their parents' problem on every other night of the week, and was entirely yours tonight. You were 11 or 12 or 13. You were the adult in the room. The understanding of that fact arrived quietly the first time you heard that door close, and settled into something permanent across the first several minutes of silence. Babysitting in 1950s suburban America was not a casual arrangement born of convenience. It was a direct product of the baby boom and the geography that surrounded it. The post-war years had produced an unprecedented number of young children in communities built quickly on the edges of American cities, sprawling subdivisions of identical houses on curving streets, where young married couples had relocated after the war and found themselves far from the grandmothers and aunts and extended family networks that had previously provided childcare without being named. The gap left by that missing network was filled by the neighborhood's older girls, who became what scholars studying the period have called the near-exclusive domain of part-time childcare, a workforce of 12 to 16-year-olds who by 1947 had made babysitting the principal form of teenage female employment in the country. By the late 1950s, girls in suburban neighborhoods were typically earning between 50 cents and $1 per hour, at a time when a bottle of Coke cost a nickel and a Saturday matinee ran a quarter. It was real money for real work, and the work was real. The word babysitter had been documented in American English as early as 1914, but did not appear in major dictionaries until the early 1950s, when the practice had become established enough that the language caught up to it. The teenage girls doing the job sometimes called it something different among themselves. The informal term that circulated in certain communities was bratting, a reference to the children being watched, who were being raised in the 1950s according to the methods of Benjamin Spock, whose book The Common Sense Book of Baby and Child Care had been published in 1946 at 25 cents per paperback copy and had sold 500,000 copies in the first 6 months after publication, reaching 1 million copies sold per year by 1956. Spock's approach was warmer and more flexible than the rigid scheduling that had preceded it, and it produced children who were accustomed to being treated with some degree of negotiability, which the girl managing bedtime on a Friday night encountered in practical terms almost immediately. What babysitting required that no other skill on this list required quite so directly was the management of another person's crisis under time pressure without parental backup available on the premises. A button came off a shirt while you were sewing, and you set it aside and finished later. A hem came loose and the garment waited in the basket. A cake failed and you threw it out and started again. A child who had fallen down the back steps did not wait. A child running a fever that had not been present when the parents left did not wait. A child crying in the dark from something that might have been a dream or might have been something else did not wait. And the decision about what to do belonged to you and to no one else within the building. The practical knowledge babysitting required was transmitted the same way most practical knowledge was transmitted in that decade, by doing it alongside someone who had already done it, and then doing it alone. An older sister who had been babysitting for 2 years showed a younger one how to test a bottle's temperature by shaking a few drops onto the inside of the wrist, not the palm but the wrist, where the skin was thinner and more sensitive, and more reliable, as a gauge of whether the milk was correctly warmed or too hot. Glass baby bottles were still standard in most households through the 1950s, Pyrex or clear glass, heated by placing them in a saucepan of hot water on the stove, rather than in a microwave, which did not yet exist in any American home. The warming had to happen gradually, and the temperature had to be checked, and a bottle given to an infant without checking was a bottle that could burn a mouth too small to refuse it, and that possibility sat in the back of the babysitter's awareness the entire time the bottle was on the stove. The emergency contact information on the pad by the phone was the most important piece of paper in the house while the parents were gone. Phone number where they would be, a secondary number if the first could not be reached, the address of the nearest hospital written in the parent's hand, the pediatrician's number if the child was young enough to need one available. In the 1950s, before 9/11 was established as a universal emergency number, individual operators handled emergency calls, and knowing how to reach an operator and what to say clearly and quickly was a skill the babysitter needed to have practiced before the situation required it. The operator asked for the address. You needed to know the address of the house you were in. Girls who had been babysitting in their own neighborhood since 12 learned the addresses of the 3 or 4 houses where they regularly worked, the same way they learned the phone numbers, as facts that lived permanently in memory because they were facts whose absence in an emergency was not recoverable. During the 1950s, formal babysitter training courses began appearing in schools and community organizations precisely because the informal transmission of the skill had proven unreliable at scale. The courses covered what a prepared babysitter knew before walking through the door, what questions to ask the parents before they left, what to do in a household emergency, how to handle a choking child, the correct way to pick up and carry an infant, how to settle a child who was resisting sleep by every available means. The professionalization that the courses represented was a response to real gaps. A girl who had learned by watching was prepared for the situations she had already seen. A girl who had taken the course was theoretically prepared for situations she had not. The best prepared babysitters were the ones who had done both. What the regular babysitter developed over time was a specific kind of confidence, the kind that comes from having been the only competent person in a building during a minor emergency and having handled it correctly. A child had fallen, the cut had been cleaned and covered, and the crying had settled into ordinary tiredness. And by the time the parents' headlights appeared in the driveway, the child was asleep, and the house was quiet, and the babysitter could give an accurate accounting of the evening. That accounting, delivered calmly and completely, and including the part about the fall, was itself a skill. You did not minimize it, and you did not dramatize it. You said what happened and what you did and what the result was. And the parents nodded, and you were paid the number of hours times the agreed rate, and you walked home in the dark or were driven home depending on the hour. And the next time that family needed a sitter, they called you first, because you had demonstrated that their house ran the same way with you in it as it ran without you. Those evenings built something in you that no classroom had quite put there before, a particular steadiness that came from having been trusted and from having been worth the trust. But the next skill on this list was practiced not at someone else's house, but at home, at the phone in the kitchen, and the rules governing it were so specific and so firm that breaking them brought consequences before the receiver was even back in the cradle. Section 10. Telephone etiquette. The phone rang and you answered it correctly or you answered it incorrectly, and the difference between those two outcomes was audible to everyone in the house, including the person on the other end of the line. Answering a phone incorrectly in a 1950s household was not the kind of error that went unaddressed. It was corrected, calmly and specifically, after the call was finished, and the correction stayed with you because the phone was going to ring again tomorrow and the day after that, and the expectation was going to be the same each time. The household telephone was not a personal instrument in the way that the tools of any other skill on this list were personal. It was a shared object representing a shared household, and the voice that answered it when it rang spoke for the entire family to whoever was calling, which meant the voice had to speak correctly. The correct way to answer the phone was by stating the family name or a greeting that identified the household. Hello, the Smith residence. Hello. Either phrasing was acceptable, and the choice between them was a family-level decision that had been made at some point in the past and was maintained consistently so that callers knew immediately where they had reached. What was not acceptable was picking up the receiver and saying nothing, or saying yeah, or saying who is it, before the caller had identified themselves. The caller had the right to state their name and purpose first. If the caller did not identify themselves after the greeting, the correct response was, "May I ask who is calling?" Not "who is this?" which was abrupt in a way that implied the household had no manners, or "what do you want?" which was worse. The phrasing was specific, and the specificity was the point. "May I ask who is calling" communicated that the household understood the conventions of telephone conversation and was participating in them correctly. By 1950, roughly 62% of American households had at least one telephone, with the proportion growing steadily through the decade as the post-war economy expanded and residential telephone service extended into newly developed suburban neighborhoods. The phone itself was leased rather than owned, rented from AT&T at a monthly rate of $1 to $3 included in the telephone bill. The instrument itself, a Western Electric rotary dial desk phone that sat on a stand or on the kitchen counter, and was the only phone in most households through the majority of the decade. The dial had 10 finger holes, digits 0 through 9, and dialing 0, which summoned the operator, took the longest, because 0 was the last position on the dial, and the dial had to travel the full arc before the mechanism released. An emergency call that required reaching the operator first was a call that required patience at the worst possible moment, which was one of the reasons that knowing the number for the police, the fire department, and the family doctor by memory was considered basic household readiness rather than an optional convenience. The party line was the specific condition that gave telephone etiquette its urgency in the early 1950s. In 1950, 75% of residential Bell system customers shared a party line, a single telephone line distributed among multiple households in a neighborhood. Each household assigned its own ring pattern, so that 2 short rings meant one family and 1 long ring meant another. And every household on the line could hear every other household's ring, and could pick up and listen if they chose to. The etiquette around party lines was both practical and social. Before placing a call, you lifted the receiver and listened to confirm the line was clear. If you heard another conversation in progress, you replaced the receiver and waited. Picking up and listening to a neighbor's conversation was understood to be eavesdropping, and was regarded with the same social contempt that any other form of eavesdropping attracted, though the temptation was real and its exercise common enough that it generated its own body of neighborhood folklore. Children on a party line who picked up the receiver and breathed quietly enough were sometimes convinced they were invisible to the conversation on the other end. They were not. Adults on party lines knew the sound of a quietly lifted receiver and knew which household it came from and remembered it. That was simply how the party line worked. Taking a message was a specific skill with specific requirements, and the requirements were not negotiable, because a message taken incorrectly was a message that did not reach its destination, and a message that did not reach its destination had consequences the girl who took it would be held responsible for. The message required 4 things written in the order they appeared: the caller's name, spelled correctly if there was any ambiguity, and the caller's telephone number, including the exchange prefix that preceded the digits in that era when phone numbers were expressed as 2 letters and 5 numbers, something like Pennsylvania 65000 or Atwater 52698. Then the time the call came in, because the time mattered for business calls and for social calls where the timing of contact was part of the message itself. Then the actual message, taken down in enough detail that the person receiving it could act on it without needing to call back to clarify what had been communicated. A message that said somebody called for Dad was not a message. It was a failure of the skill. Long-distance calls occupied a different category entirely, and were understood as such by every person in a 1950s household. A long-distance call in the early part of the decade ran approximately 25 to 40 cents for the first 3 minutes between cities within a few hundred miles, with the rate rising for greater distances, in an era when 25 cents still purchased a meaningful quantity of things. Long distance was not casual, and was not for conversation that could wait for a letter. When the long-distance operator's voice came through the receiver confirming that a call was being connected from somewhere far away, the household understood that something significant had either happened or needed to be said, and the phone was handed to whoever the call was for without delay, and with the implicit understanding that the call would be kept to its purpose and not extended beyond it, because every additional minute was a choice being made at real expense. The rules around duration applied to local calls as well, particularly in households still on party lines where prolonged use of the telephone was a form of rudeness toward the neighbors sharing the line. Emily Post, in her 1950 edition of Etiquette, addressed telephone conduct with the same specificity she brought to table settings and correspondence, noting that a telephone call should be no longer than necessary, that shouting into the receiver was unnecessary given the instrument's technology, and that repeating goodbye multiple times while failing to end the call was a habit that wasted both parties' time and the household's access to the line. The rule against saying goodbye more than once was a rule that children were taught early and that adults held to seriously. You said goodbye, you replaced the receiver, the conversation was over. Whatever remained unsaid could go in a letter. What the telephone required that distinguished it from every other skill was real-time performance with no opportunity for revision. The darned sock could be unraveled and redone. The hemmed dress could have the stitches removed. The thank you note could be drafted on scratch paper before going on to good stationery. The phone call happened once, in the moment, with the other person present on the line, and whatever was said was said. A girl who answered the phone correctly and took the message accurately and ended the call politely had demonstrated competence in a medium that left no evidence of itself and required no tools and produced nothing visible. The only proof of the skill was the call itself, and the call was over in 3 minutes, and nobody who had not been in the room would ever know how it had gone. The household knew, the caller knew. That was enough. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That phone was answered correctly every time, and the message was on the pad before the receiver was back in the cradle. But there was one more skill coming, and it was the quietest one on this list. The one practiced not with needles or an iron or a pen, but with a measuring cup and a column of numbers and a weekly envelope of cash that had to stretch further than it looked like it could. Section 11. Meal planning and budgeting. Saturday morning was when it happened. Before the shopping and before the cooking and before anything else that the week required, someone sat down with a pencil and a pad of paper and worked out what the family would eat for the next 7 days and what it was going to cost. The pencil moved down the column. The numbers added up. The total either fit inside the week's food money or it did not. And if it did not, the pencil went back to the top and something was reconsidered, and the reconsideration happened until the number worked. This was not a skill that appeared in any single conversation. It was absorbed over years of being in the room while it happened, watching the column of numbers and the list of meals take shape together, understanding gradually that the two things were not separate activities, but one activity conducted simultaneously, the menu and the money inseparable from the start. The average American family in 1951 spent approximately 22% of its disposable income on food, totaling roughly $814 for the year, against an average family income of $3,700. That figure was not abstract. It was a number that shaped every grocery list and every week's worth of meals, because spending above it meant going without something else, and going below it meant eating less than the household needed. A gallon of milk ran around 83 cents in 1950. A dozen eggs cost 60 cents. A loaf of bread was 30 cents. A pound of ground beef came in at 53 cents, while a porterhouse steak at 95 cents per pound was a purchase that required occasion to justify it. A 10-pound bag of potatoes sold for 35 cents in Kansas in 1953, and was the kind of purchase that stretched across multiple meals in multiple forms, which was precisely why it appeared on grocery lists with regularity. The skill of budgeting was the skill of understanding which items multiplied and which ones vanished, and building the week's meals around the ones that multiplied. A home economics instructor whose course notes were collected in a trade journal of the period described the 4 distinct problems facing any household cook as planning, purchasing, preparing, and presenting. Planning came first and was the foundation of everything else, because a cook who arrived at the store without a plan left with whatever caught her attention and spent more than the envelope held, and a cook who arrived with a plan built from what she already had in the pantry and what was on sale that week spent less and wasted less. The shopping list was the physical proof that the planning had been done. You did not go to the store without it, and you did not deviate from it, except for a specific reason, which was a rule that the household's food budget enforced regardless of what any individual in the family might have preferred. Leftovers were not incidental to the week's plan. They were part of it. A pot roast on Sunday became Monday's hash, which became Tuesday's soup if there was enough broth from the original cooking. A roast chicken became sandwiches, became soup, became the occasion to make a stock that flavored the next several days of cooking without additional expense. A January 1953 article in a homemaking magazine described the practice with the flat certainty of something obvious, noting that a good cook shops her own pantry first and plans to use what is already there before it spoils. The article was not describing thrift as a virtue. It was describing it as a competence, as the difference between a household that managed its food money effectively and one that did not, between a cook who planned and one who improvised, with the understanding that improvisation, however satisfying in other domains, was expensive in the kitchen. Girls learned this skill by standing next to the woman who was doing it, watching the pencil move down the column, understanding which protein cost less per serving, and why a cheaper cut braised for 3 hours produced more food value and more flavor than an expensive one cooked quickly. Understanding why the seasonal vegetable cost less than the one shipped from somewhere else, and why that difference mattered when multiplied across 52 weeks of grocery shopping. By the time a girl was 10 or 11, she was expected to know what things cost in general terms, not to the penny, but approximately, well enough to notice when a price had changed and understand whether the change was significant. A family that paid 60 cents for a dozen eggs in 1950 and 79 cents by mid-decade had registered a real shift in what that purchase cost relative to the rest of the week's budget. And a girl who had been watching the column of numbers for several years registered it too. The household food budget was not a theoretical exercise. In many households, it arrived as a physical envelope of cash, the week's grocery money counted out and set in the kitchen at the beginning of the week, and the grocery list was written knowing exactly how much was in the envelope. When the envelope was spent, the week's grocery buying was done, and the meals from that point forward came from what was already in the kitchen. This was not hardship as a concept. It was a practical system for managing a limited resource, and the system worked because the planning at the front of the week was thorough enough that the envelope rarely ran out before the week did. A girl who grew up watching the envelope learned what adequate planning looked like by watching it succeed, and learned what insufficient planning looked like by watching it fall short. And the two lessons together were more durable than any classroom instruction could have produced. What meal planning and budgeting taught, more than any specific number or any specific price, was the habit of thinking one step ahead, of understanding that the Tuesday meal depended on the Saturday decision, and the Saturday decision depended on the Thursday purchase, and all of it depended on a number written at the top of the column before any of the other numbers went in. The total came first. The meals were built inside it. That sequence, and the discipline it required, was not glamorous, and was not named, and did not produce anything you could hold or wear or serve. It produced a household that ate well through 7 days on a fixed amount of money, which was the thing the skill was for, and which was evidence enough that it had been learned. Those numbers in the column added up correctly every week, and the envelope lasted until Friday, and everyone in the house ate. But there was one more skill waiting, and it was the last one on this list, and it was the one that required no tools and no materials and no instructions that anyone ever wrote down, because what it required was already inside you, assembled from everything that came before it. Section 12. Posture and Deportment. Nobody handed you a tool for this one. There was no needle, no pattern, no iron, no column of numbers. The skill was carried in the body itself, in the precise relationship between the spine and the shoulders and the chin, and it was visible or it was not, and its presence or absence was noticed by every adult in any room you walked into before you had opened your mouth or said a single word. You stood a certain way because a girl in that decade stood a certain way, and the way you stood announced something about your household and your upbringing and yourself, and the announcement happened continuously, whether or not you were paying attention to it. Good posture in the 1950s was not a wellness concept. It was a social obligation, with measurable social consequences. Schools had been formally evaluating and correcting children's posture since at least 1913, when educator Jesse Bancroft published a systematic guide to posture assessment in school settings, and developed evaluation methods that were adopted across the country, leading to routine posture checks conducted in public school classrooms through the 1940s. Most school posture clinics closed by the early 1950s as the institutional focus shifted elsewhere, but the standard the clinics had enforced did not disappear. It migrated home, into the correction delivered at the kitchen table when a girl slouched over her homework, into the firm hand placed between the shoulder blades of a child sitting slumped in a church pew, into the look that meant straighten up before the look had to become words. The standing posture was specific, shoulders back and down, not pulled up toward the ears but settled into their natural position, with the blades drawing slightly toward each other, chin parallel to the floor, not lifted and not dropped. Weight distributed across both feet, neither hip jutting to one side, one foot placed slightly in front of the other when standing still for any length of time, which distributed the weight more naturally and prevented the locked knee stance that made the legs ache. The posture manuals and charm school guides of the era, including the widely read Charm and Poise guides sold through beauty schools and department stores through the 1950s, described the correct standing posture in terms of an imaginary vertical line running from the top of the skull straight down through the ear, the shoulder, the hip, the knee, and the ankle, with every part of the body arranged along that line, without deviation in either direction. The line was the standard. You measured yourself against it by standing against a flat wall and noticing which parts of your back made contact and which did not. Sitting had its own separate rules. Both feet flat on the floor or ankles crossed neatly at one side, never legs crossed at the knee, which was considered inelegant and was thought to restrict circulation. Acclaim the medical texts of the period supported with varying degrees of rigor. Back straight without pressing into the chair's backrest, the spine maintaining its own position rather than relying on the furniture to hold it. Hands in the lap or on the table surface, not tucked under the thighs or dangling at the sides. In home economics class, teachers had been documented correcting posture while girls were cooking or sewing, the instruction running that proper carriage was not something reserved for formal occasions, but was the continuous condition of the body, regardless of what the hands were doing. The girl who stood correctly over an ironing board and the girl who stood correctly at a dinner table were the same girl, maintaining the same standard, because the standard did not take breaks. The book on the head was the classic training exercise, and its use was real, not merely a cliché manufactured after the fact. Finishing schools and deportment classes used it specifically because it forced the spine into correct alignment through the mechanics of balance. A book balanced on a moving head required the neck to be perfectly vertical and the spine to be straight beneath it, because any deviation in either direction sent the book sliding. You could not fake the book. You could learn to arrange your face into whatever expression was wanted. You could remember to pull your shoulders back at the moment of inspection. You could make the correct posture appear briefly on demand. The book demanded it continuously, demanded it while walking, demanded it through every step of a room's length. And the girl who could walk the full length of a room without losing the book had internalized the alignment rather than simply remembering it. Walking was its own instruction. The gait required by the deportment guides of the decade was specific enough to be taught, the feet tracking along a line rather than swinging wide, the stride measured and unhurried, the hips neither swaying excessively nor held rigid. Audrey Hepburn and Grace Kelly, the two women whose physical presentation most defined the decade's ideal of feminine bearing, both moved with the particular quality that good posture produced, the quality of having arrived in a room without having announced the arrival by the manner of walking. A girl whose footsteps could be heard coming down a hallway from 2 rooms away was a girl whose carriage required attention. A girl who appeared at the door of a room was the goal. The posture was what made the difference. Home economics classes taught deportment alongside cooking and sewing in many schools through the 1950s, treating it as part of the same curriculum of household and social preparation. The logic was consistent with everything else in that curriculum. The skills a girl carried in her body and her bearing were skills she would use in every context for the rest of her life. In the same way the hem stitch and the hospital corner and the properly set table were skills that would accompany her daily. The posture required no materials and cost nothing. It required only the decision to maintain it, made freshly each time the body defaulted to the easier position it preferred when unsupervised. By the early 1960s, the formal instruction in deportment was fading from most schools. As the broader cultural shift away from conformist post-war standards reached the classroom and the home economics curriculum both, the posture clinics had already closed. The charm school guides sat on shelves gathering dust. What remained was the correction issued at the table, the hand between the shoulder blades, the quiet reminder that had been issued to you often enough in your earliest years, that your body remembered it long after anyone stopped saying it out loud. You stood a certain way. You still do, sometimes, without thinking about why. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That spine straightened without being told, and the room noticed without saying so. There are still 6 skills left on this list, and the next one is the only one that turned what you already knew how to do into something that could be given away, something made from thread and patience that outlasted the occasion that produced it. Section 13. Embroidery. The hoop went onto the fabric first, the inner ring laid flat on the table, the fabric placed over it, the outer ring pressed down to hold the fabric taut between the 2 circles. You tightened the screw on the outer ring just enough that the fabric was drum tight without distorting the weave, and you knew it was right by pressing one finger against the center and feeling the resistance. Too loose, and the needle would push the fabric rather than pierce it cleanly. Too tight and the weave stretched and the finished stitches sat on a bias that pulling the hoop off would reveal. The correct tension was the same invisible judgment that appeared in every other handwork skill, the one that lived in the fingers rather than in any instruction, the one that could not be described adequately to someone whose hands had not yet learned it. The design was already on the fabric before the hoop went on, iron-on transfer patterns, sold by Aunt Martha's Hot Iron Transfers and the Vogart Company and the Colonial Pattern Company throughout the 1950s, came on thin paper, printed with lines of special ink that released under the heat of a hot iron and transferred directly to the fabric below. You positioned the paper face down on the cotton, pressed a warm iron across it for several seconds, lifted the paper carefully, and the design appeared on the fabric in a dotted blue or purple line, ready to be covered with stitches. A single transfer sheet could be used several times before the ink was exhausted, the impressions becoming lighter with each use. And the patterns themselves ran from simple florals to the days of the week kitchen figures that were among the most popular designs of the decade. 7 small figures, 1 for each day. A girl or a kitten performing the day's household chore. Monday for washing, Tuesday for ironing, Wednesday for mending, working through the week to Sunday for rest. A set of 7 dish towels embroidered with the days of the week figures was a complete project with a practical function and a clear endpoint, which made it an ideal assignment for a girl who was learning. The stitches built from each other in complexity. The outline stitch, also called the stem stitch, was where most beginners started, the needle entering the fabric behind the previous stitch and emerging ahead of it on the same side, producing a twisted rope-like line that followed the curves of a design cleanly and held its shape on washed fabric. The outline stitch covered the blue transfer lines and left nothing exposed, which was the minimum standard. When the embroidery was finished, no transfer ink should remain visible from the front of the fabric. The satin stitch filled in solid areas, the needle passing back and forth across a shape with parallel threads laid side by side until the entire shape was covered in a smooth, lustrous surface. The direction of the satin stitch relative to the shape mattered to the final appearance, the threads running at an angle rather than straight across the widest part, so that the light caught them evenly and the surface appeared smooth rather than segmented. A petal stitched with the threads running at the correct angle reflected light uniformly. A petal stitched with threads running parallel to the stem, cutting straight across the narrowest parts of the shape, produced a result that looked flat and inattentive, and the difference was visible across a room. The lazy daisy was the stitch that girls produced first and fastest, because it required only 2 movements and produced a complete petal or leaf with each repetition. The needle brought up through the center point, a loop of thread held against the fabric. The needle passed back through the center and brought up at the tip of the loop with a small anchoring stitch to hold it. 5 or 6 lazy daisy stitches arranged around a French knot center produced a complete flower in under a minute, and a pillowcase with a spray of those flowers in the corner could be finished over the course of an afternoon in front of the television. The French knot itself was the stitch that sorted experienced needleworkers from beginners with the most efficiency, requiring the thread to be wound twice around the needle shaft close to the fabric surface. The needle then passed back through at almost the same point it had emerged, the knot forming at the surface as the thread pulled through. A French knot made correctly was a firm, round bead of thread. A French knot made with the needle returning to the wrong point, or with the thread winding too loosely, was a pulled tangle that had to be cut out and the thread started again. Pillowcases were the standard embroidery project for a girl in the 1950s, and the tradition behind the embroidered pillowcase was older than any of the women teaching it. The hope chest, also called a trousseau chest, was the physical object that represented a girl's preparation for eventual household life. The cedar-lined wooden chest, in which she accumulated the household linens she would bring to a marriage. Tablecloths, napkins, dish towels, pillowcases, sheets. The expectation that a girl would have contributed her own handwork to that chest by the time she left her parents' home was so consistent across the decade that embroidery for the hope chest had its own category in the 5 and dime pattern collections and its own section in the women's magazines, patterns specifically designed for pillowcases and dresser scarves and guest towels, practical items that would be used rather than displayed, the work incorporated into the daily life of a household rather than framed as decoration. DMC, the French thread company founded in 1746 as Dolphus Migue et Compagnie, dominated the American embroidery thread market through the 1950s, with its 6-strand cotton embroidery floss, available in hundreds of colors. The strands separated for finer work or used together for heavier coverage, depending on the project. A skein of DMC floss sold for a few cents at any 5 and dime or notions counter, and the color range was extensive enough that matching the pinks and greens and yellows of a floral transfer pattern was never a problem of availability, only of selection. The thread was the least expensive component of the skill. The hoop cost 50 cents. The transfer patterns ran a dime to a quarter. The time was the investment, and the time came back as a finished pillowcase that would outlast the decade it was made in, the stitches still present, and the colors still readable, 50 years later, in a cedar chest that smelled of the wood it had been built from. What embroidery produced that no other skill on this list produced was an object of deliberate beauty made by your hands and given to someone else, or kept in a chest for your own eventual household. It was the skill most explicitly organized around making something that would be used long after the occasion that made it, something that carried the mark of the hands that made it into rooms those hands might never enter. That needle went through the fabric and the design appeared one stitch at a time, and what came out of the hoop at the end was something that had not existed before. But there was one more skill the kitchen required, the quietest and most fundamental one, and it had nothing to do with cooking. It was about reading, specifically about reading instructions precisely enough that what came out of the oven was what the instructions described and nothing else. Section 14. Reading a recipe. The recipe had to be read completely before anything was touched. That was the first rule, and the most violated one. The rule that no beginning cook followed until they had failed at least once by not following it. By starting into a recipe and discovering halfway through that it called for an ingredient that was not in the kitchen, or a technique that would have been easier to understand before the batter was already in the bowl, or a rest period of 4 hours that the cook had not accounted for when she began at 4 in the afternoon for a 6 o'clock dinner. The experienced cook read the whole recipe first. Read it the way you read a set of directions before starting a journey, getting the full picture before making the first move. The beginning cook skipped this step. The beginning cook learned. Reading a recipe was not a passive activity. It required the reader to translate written instruction into a sequence of physical actions in the correct order, to hold the full sequence in mind while executing each individual step, and to recognize when a term in the instructions described a specific technique rather than a general direction. The word fold was not the same as the word stir. The word cream was not the same as the word mix. The word simmer was not the same as the word boil. Each of those distinctions changed the outcome of the dish in ways that could not be corrected after the fact. And the distinction lived in the vocabulary, in knowing what the word meant before the bowl was on the counter. Fanny Farmer, whose 1896 Boston Cooking School cookbook had sold 360,000 copies by the time of her death in 1915 and had done more to standardize American recipe writing than any other single publication, had insisted that all measurements be leveled across the top of the measuring cup or spoon rather than rounded into a dome. The leveled measurement was the repeatable measurement, the one that produced the same result in any kitchen that executed it correctly, regardless of how loosely or tightly packed the cook's spoon might have been. Before Farmer's insistence on this standard, the phrase "a cup of flour" could mean almost anything depending on who was scooping and how. After it, a cup meant a level cup measured in a standard cup measure, and the recipe could be trusted to reproduce its result in any kitchen where it was followed precisely. By the 1950s, that standard was fully embedded in American home economics education. The correct way to measure flour was specific. Spoon the flour lightly into the dry measuring cup rather than scooping the cup directly into the flour bag, which compacted the flour and produced up to 30% more flour per cup than the recipe intended. Then level the top with the flat back of a butter knife, drawn across the rim of the cup in a single clean stroke. The single stroke was necessary because a sawing motion disturbed the flour below the rim and added or removed small amounts inconsistently. Dry ingredients went into dry measuring cups. Liquid ingredients went into liquid measuring cups. Glass or clear plastic with a pouring spout, read at eye level on a flat surface, with the meniscus at the measurement line, rather than the bottom of the cup above it. Brown sugar was packed into the measuring cup, pressed down firmly, and turned out in a shape that held together and released the cup's form. Powdered sugar was sifted first, and then spooned and leveled. Shortening was packed in and leveled. Butter was measured by the marked wrapper. Each ingredient had its correct method, and the method mattered because the recipe assumed you were using it. Home economics classes in the 1950s, devoted considerable curriculum time to measurement, specifically because the failure of a baked product was almost always traceable to a measurement error. A teaspoon of baking powder that was actually a heaping teaspoon produced a cake that rose too fast and collapsed. A half cup of sugar that was actually 3/4 of a cup produced a cookie that spread too thin and burned at the edges before the center set. The home economics instructor who documented these failures in a trade journal of the period described the lesson consistently. The recipe is a contract between the person who wrote it and the person who reads it, and the contract requires that the reader execute the measurements as written rather than as approximated. A cook who understood that contract could reproduce any recipe reliably. A cook who treated the measurements as suggestions was cooking something else. The sequence of a recipe's instructions was as important as the measurements within it. Room temperature butter was specified because cold butter would not cream with sugar, and the creaming was what produced the cake's structure. Eggs added one at a time were specified because all at once could break the emulsion. Flour added alternating with liquid was specified because the alternation prevented the gluten from overdeveloping before the fat could coat the flour proteins and tenderize the crumb. None of these explanations appeared in the recipe itself. The recipe said room temperature butter, add eggs one at a time, alternate flour and liquid in 3 additions. The explanations were what home economics class provided. A girl who had received the explanations could read a new recipe and understand which steps were critical and which had more flexibility, and she could adapt without failing because she understood why each step asked what it asked. Cooking terms were vocabulary that had to be learned before the words were encountered in the middle of a recipe with the oven already hot. Blanch meant to boil briefly and then transfer immediately to ice water to stop the cooking. Fold meant to combine delicate mixtures using a gentle under and over motion that preserved the air already beaten into them. Dredge meant to coat lightly with flour or breadcrumbs. Render meant to cook fat slowly until it melted and clarified. Scald meant to heat liquid just below boiling until a film appeared on the surface. These were not the vocabulary of everyday speech, and a girl who encountered them for the first time while trying to follow a recipe encountered them as obstacles. A girl who had been taught them in home economics class encountered them as instructions. What reading a recipe taught, more than any individual technique it described, was the discipline of following a sequence precisely while trusting that the sequence was correct, even when individual steps seemed puzzling. The reason for folding rather than stirring was not always apparent at the moment of folding. The reason for adding the eggs one at a time was not visible in the batter. The outcome was the proof of the process, and the process required trust in the instruction as written. A girl who had learned to trust a recipe had learned something that went further than baking. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That recipe was followed precisely, and the oven timer told the truth, and what came out matched what was promised. But there are still 4 skills left, and the next one happened not in the kitchen but outdoors or over a sink, and it was the one that turned summer fruit into something that would still be on the shelf in January, sealed under a metal lid that popped when you pressed the center. Section 15. Home canning. The sound that told you it had worked was a ping. A single clean metallic note, brief and certain, coming from the row of jars cooling on the counter after they came out of the water bath. Each lid made the sound at its own moment, as the jar cooled, and the vacuum inside pulled the center of the lid down, sealing it against the rim. You could be in another room and hear it. You knew exactly what it was. And you knew, before you even went to look, that the jar that had made the sound was good, that what was inside it was sealed and safe, and would stay that way in the cellar or the pantry, through however many months stood between the August afternoon when you processed it, and the January morning when you brought it up and opened it, and the kitchen filled with the smell of summer peaches. Home canning was a skill that arrived with summer and was completed before fall was full. The produce set the schedule. Strawberries came first, in June, and strawberry jam was frequently the first thing a girl made because the process for jam was more forgiving than the process for whole fruit, the high sugar content working alongside the acidity to make spoilage unlikely, even if the technique was imprecise in minor ways. Peaches came in July and August, and canning peaches whole or halved in light syrup was a longer and more demanding process than jam, requiring the fruit to be blanched first, so the skins slipped off cleanly. Each peach halved and pitted and packed into the heated jar without bruising, the syrup poured over with a 1/4 inch of headspace left at the top. Tomatoes followed in August and September, canned whole or crushed with a teaspoon of bottled lemon juice added per quart jar to ensure the acidity was sufficient for safe water bath processing, a step the United States Department of Agriculture had been recommending since the agency began issuing home canning guidance in the first decade of the century. Guidance that was updated and refined with each decade as the science of food preservation improved. The Ball Corporation had been manufacturing glass mason jars in Muncie, Indiana, since 1887, and by the 1950s, Ball jars were the standard of the American home canning operation, their blue-tinted glass giving way through the decade to clear glass as manufacturing shifted, their 2-piece metal lids composed of a flat lid with a sealing compound around the underside and a separate screw band that held the lid in place during processing. The lid was used only once, because the sealing compound that made contact with the jar rim was compressed during processing and would not create a reliable seal a second time. The screw band could be reused indefinitely. This distinction was taught early because using an old lid was one of the most common causes of canning failure, and canning failure meant either throwing out the contents or, in the worst case with improperly processed low-acid foods, a risk of botulism that the USDA had been specifically warning about since the 1920s. The water bath canner was a large speckled enamel pot, deep enough that filled jars sitting on its rack were covered by at least 1 inch of boiling water during processing, with a fitted lid and a wire rack that lifted out and held the jars off the pot's floor, so the boiling water could circulate underneath them. The canner itself held 7 quart jars at a time in most standard sizes, and a morning's worth of canning could fill it 2 or 3 times before the produce was processed. The pot came out of the cellar or the back of the cabinet before the summer canning season and went back after the last jar of tomatoes was sealed, a seasonal object as specific to its purpose as the ironing board was to its own. The sequence of steps was non-negotiable and was taught in that order because the order was the safety. Wash the jars. Sterilize the jars in simmering water or the oven. Prepare the lids in hot water. Prepare the food according to the recipe. Fill the hot jars with the hot food using a wide-mouth canning funnel, leaving the headspace specified for that type of food. a 1/4 inch for jams and jellies, a 1/2 inch for fruits and pickles. Wipe the jar rim with a clean damp cloth to remove any food residue that would prevent a seal. Center the lid. Apply the screw band to fingertip tightness, which meant tight enough to hold the lid in place, but not so tight that air could not escape during processing. Lower the jars into the boiling water bath. Process for the time specified in the tested recipe for that food type and your altitude. Remove the jars with a jar lifter, set them on a clean towel 2 inches apart to cool without touching, and do not press the lid center or tilt the jars or disturb them in any way for 12 to 24 hours. Then press the center of each lid. If it flexed up and down, the jar had not sealed and needed to be refrigerated and used promptly. If the center was firm and did not move, the ping had happened and the seal was good. What you were actually building with each sealed jar was not just preserved food but time, specifically the gap between abundance and scarcity that summer canning bridged. A pantry shelf holding 30-quart jars of peaches and tomatoes and green beans and jams in September represented the work of several weeks of summer mornings, translated into meals that would appear on the table through the winter months, when fresh produce either did not exist or cost more than the household's food budget could absorb. The women who canned had learned this from women who had grown up with it as a genuine necessity, who had canned because the alternative was going without, and who had passed the skill forward into a decade where freezers were becoming available, and canned goods from commercial producers cost pennies at the grocery store. But the skill survived because the people who had it understood something that the convenience alternatives could not replicate: the particular quality of food you had put up yourself, from produce you had selected at peak ripeness, processed with your own hands, and brought up from the cellar in January, when the temperature outside dropped below freezing, and the jar opened with a sound that was the opposite of a ping, a soft exhale of pressure releasing, and the smell that came out was August. Those jars lined up on the shelf, and the ping happened down the row one at a time. 3 skills left, and the next is about something the household ran through every week without a single person naming it as a skill: the system that kept everything clean that needed to be clean, and did it in the right order for the right reasons. Section 16. Cleaning the house. Cleaning moved from high to low and from dry to wet, and if you did not know that before you started, you learned it the first time you mopped a floor, and then had to dust the furniture and watch the dust fall onto the clean floor, and had to mop again. The sequence was not arbitrary. It was the product of understanding that gravity existed and that cleaning worked with it rather than against it, that the ceiling and the high shelves and the tops of the furniture gave up their dust and it fell, and if the floor was already clean when it fell, you had added work to yourself that the correct order would have prevented. A girl who had been taught the sequence did not make that error. She dusted from the tops of things downward. She vacuumed before she mopped. She worked from the far end of the room toward the door, so she did not walk back across what she had already cleaned. These were not rules that required memorizing. They were a logic that made the work easier. And once you understood the logic, the sequence became the only sensible way to proceed. The weekly cleaning schedule divided the house's work across the days of the week, so that no single day became overwhelming, and every surface received attention on a reliable rotation. Monday was washing day, Tuesday was ironing, Wednesday or Thursday was the thorough cleaning of the main rooms, Friday or Saturday was the kitchen and the bathroom, the 2 rooms that required the most specific products and the most particular technique, because they were the 2 rooms where cleanliness was not only aesthetic, but sanitary. The bathroom floor was washed, not swept and left, but washed with a mop and disinfectant. The sink basin was scoured, the toilet was cleaned inside and out, the tub was scrubbed. This was not weekly maintenance in the loose sense of the word. It was weekly restoration to a specific standard, and the standard was the same each week regardless of how much or how little use the room had received. The products each had their specific domain and their specific application. Bon Ami, in production since 1886 under the J.T. Robertson Soap Company, with its feldspar formula and its famous slogan announcing it had not yet scratched, was the cleaner for porcelain and chrome that needed scouring without the damage that harsher abrasives caused. Its chick hatching from egg logo on the powder can, as recognizable on a 1950s bathroom shelf as anything in the house. Ajax, introduced by Colgate-Palmolive in 1947, with the marketing line "Stronger than Dirt," competed directly with Bon Ami for the bathroom and kitchen scouring role, its chlorinated formula adding disinfecting capacity that the older products could not match. Old Dutch Cleanser had been on American shelves since 1905, its bonnet-wearing Dutch-made mascot appearing in magazine advertisements through the decade, the 10-cent can of powder a fixture under kitchen sinks across the country. Comet arrived in 1956 and quickly gained ground by combining the abrasive scrubbing of the older powders with the bleaching action of chlorine. and by the late 1950s it was displacing older brands in many households because it cleaned and whitened simultaneously, which the products it replaced could not do. The kitchen sink was the test of a properly maintained kitchen, the surface that showed use and showed neglect with equal clarity. A sink scrubbed with powder cleanser and rinsed completely clean had a dull matte surface that reflected the overhead light evenly, without water spots or gray film. A sink left for 2 days without attention had a gray ring at the waterline and soap residue dried along the faucet base and a general quality of having been used without being restored. A girl who maintained the kitchen sink daily understood that the quick 5-minute task performed each evening prevented the 30-minute task that accumulated when the quick task was skipped. This was not a lesson taught through lecturing. It was a lesson taught through being assigned the 30-minute task on the day when the quick task had been skipped. Floors required understanding the surface before applying water to it. Hardwood floors were swept and damp mopped, not wet mopped, because excess water raised the grain and warped the boards over time, and a warped floor could not be unperked. Linoleum, which covered most kitchen floors through the 1950s, and was the standard floor surface for bathrooms and utility rooms, could be mopped with more water, and then waxed afterward. The wax applied in thin coats with a cloth or applicator, and buffed to a shine that protected the surface, and gave it the particular gleam that a Good Housekeeping article from 1952 described as the mark of a well-kept kitchen. The waxed floor held its surface longer and cleaned more easily the next week, because the wax prevented dirt from penetrating the linoleum itself. This was the underlying principle of most household maintenance. The preservation of a surface required slightly more effort in the short term, and substantially less effort over the longer term, and a girl who understood that principle approached cleaning differently than one who did not. Window cleaning required newspaper and vinegar, or a commercial window cleaner like Windex, which had been introduced in 1933, used sparingly on the glass, and rubbed out in circular motions with the newspaper. The newsprint leaving no lint behind, and the acidity cutting through the film that accumulated on glass from cooking vapors and ordinary dust. The result was a window that did not distort the light passing through it, and a room with clean windows looked different from a room with filmed ones, in a way that was immediately apparent to anyone who entered but impossible to name precisely. The light in a room with clean windows was simply cleaner, and a household that maintained its windows maintained a particular quality of interior that the household understood as correct without ever discussing it. What cleaning the house required that no other skill on this list quite required was the discipline to maintain something that would be immediately undone by ordinary living. A darned sock stayed darned. A sealed jar stayed sealed. A clean house was dirty again by the following Tuesday, and the work began again, and the standard was the same, and the sequence was the same, and this was understood not as futility, but as the ongoing cost of a household that functioned the way a household should. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That floor was mopped on schedule, and the sink was scoured on schedule, and the house ran the way it was supposed to run. One skill left, and it is the one that held every other skill together, the one you practiced in every room without naming it, the one that was already inside you before anyone taught it to you, and the one you carry still. Section 17. Hand-washing delicates. The wringer machine was not for everything. That distinction was established before the washing happened, during the sorting that came first, when the laundry pile was divided into what could go through the wringer and what could not. Cotton sheets and cotton shirts and sturdy things went through. The wool sweater did not. The silk blouse did not. The embroidered pillowcases did not. And neither did the lace-trimmed anything. And neither did the knitted cardigan you had spent 3 weeks making. Because the machine that worked so efficiently on everything else would felt the wool, or shred the lace, or distort the knit, until it was no longer the shape it had been when it went in. The sorting happened first because undoing what the wringer did to a silk blouse was not possible. The machine was for durability. Your hands were for everything else. The sink filled with cool water, never warm and never hot, because heat did to wool what the wringer did to lace. It caused the fibers to lock into each other in a process called felting, the microscopic scales on each wool fiber meshing permanently together, shrinking the garment 2 sizes and stiffening it beyond recovery. A wool sweater that went into water even slightly too warm came out a child's sweater, and nothing could reverse it. The temperature of the water was therefore not a preference, but a specification, and testing it with the wrist, the way you tested a baby's bottle for warmth, was the correct method. The inside of the wrist, more sensitive to temperature than the palm, and more reliable as a gauge. Cool enough that the wrist registered no heat was cool enough for wool. Lux soap flakes were the standard for hand-washing delicates through the 1950s. Their thin flaked form dissolving quickly in cool water without leaving the residue that bar soap left. marketed specifically for fine fabrics in advertisements that ran in women's magazines through the decade. A tablespoon of flakes to a sink of water was enough. More soap did not produce cleaner results. It produced harder rinsing, and the possibility of soap residue left in the fibers that would stiffen the fabric when it dried, and attract dirt faster than the unrinsed garment would have. The understanding that more soap was not better soap was counterintuitive and was frequently learned the hard way. The garment went into the water and you moved it through the suds gently, squeezing the water through the fabric rather than rubbing it against itself. Silk especially could not be rubbed. The friction that was exactly what you wanted when scrubbing a dirty collar worked in reverse on silk, damaging the surface sheen that made silk what it was, leaving dull marks in the fabric that dry cleaning could sometimes address and sometimes could not. You moved the silk through the water the way you moved a delicate object through a crowd, without letting it contact anything that would damage it, holding it carefully, not putting it under any stress that was not necessary. The washing took 5 minutes at most. The rinsing took longer, clean water run through the fabric repeatedly until no trace of soap remained and the rinse water ran clear. Soap residue left in wool or silk stiffened on drying, and the stiffness told on itself immediately when the garment was worn. Wool sweaters were pressed between 2 clean towels to remove excess water, never wrung, never twisted, because wool lost structural integrity when wet, and the tension of wringing distorted the knit in ways that only became visible after drying, when one shoulder was suddenly longer than the other, or the ribbing at the hem had stretched into a wavy edge that blocking could address partially and never completely. Blocking was the step after washing, and was itself a skill, the wet sweater laid on a clean towel in its correct dimensions, the edges pinned or smoothed into the shape it was supposed to hold, left to dry completely flat and away from direct heat or sun. A sweater blocked carefully came out of the process looking as it was supposed to look. A sweater dried hanging on a line stretched vertically from its own wet weight and came out elongated at the shoulders and compressed at the body. The flat drying was not optional. Silk dried differently, hung or laid flat depending on the garment's weight, but always away from direct sunlight, because even an hour of direct sun began to degrade silk fibers in a way that was not immediately visible, and became apparent over months as the fabric lost its luster. The girls who knew this had been told it while watching someone else hang a silk blouse in the shade of the porch rather than in the full sun where the cotton shirts went. The reason was explained once. It did not need to be explained again. What hand-washing delicates required that made it different from any other cleaning task was the sustained quality of attention it demanded for every minute it was happening. The wringer machine could be loaded and left. The heavy cotton laundry could be checked periodically. The delicate wash required continuous presence, hands in the water, the garment moving through the suds at the pace the fabric needed, rather than the pace the washer would have imposed. You could not rush it, and you could not delegate it to a machine, and you could not do it adequately while thinking about something else. The garment was in your hands, and it required your hands until it was done. Everything on this list that involved making something from fabric, the sewed seams, the darned heels, the embroidered flowers on the pillowcase, the knitted rows of a sweater, produced an object that would last as long as it was cared for correctly, and would fail much sooner than it should if it was not. Hand-washing was the care that preserved everything else, the skill that protected the work of all the other skills, the one that connected them without anyone naming the connection. That sink was left empty and clean, and the sweater was on its towel drying flat, and every garment in the household lasted longer because of how it was handled when it was wet. One skill remains, and it is the one the others were all in service of, the one that ran underneath everything on this list without appearing on any of them. Section 18. Knowing the house. Before anyone told you, you knew. That was the thing about the final skill, the one that took the longest to name because it had no procedure attached to it, and required no specific tool, and produced nothing you could hold or show or put on a shelf. You simply knew that the flour canister was getting low without opening it, because you remembered the weight of it the last time you lifted it, and the weight had been different today. You knew the hem on your sister's dress was giving way before she mentioned it, because you had been trained to notice seams the way you had been trained to notice everything else in the household that required attention before it became a problem. You knew the kitchen window needed cleaning because the quality of the light through it had changed by a degree that no one would have articulated as a change, but that you registered as a difference. The house spoke to you, and you had learned to hear it. Not because hearing it was a gift, but because you had spent enough years inside it, doing the things the list described, paying attention while you did them, that the house had become a system you understood from the inside. Domestic attentiveness was what the home economics curriculum of the 1950s was training when it trained everything else. The individual skills were the curriculum. The underlying competence they built was this: the ability to move through a household and know its state at any given moment without having to inspect it deliberately. A girl who had been making beds every morning for 4 years could tell whether a bed had been made correctly from a glance at the doorway. A girl who had been ironing shirts since she was 10 registered a poorly pressed collar in a room full of conversation. A girl who had been setting the table since she was 7 noticed the knife blade turned the wrong direction before anyone sat down. This was not perfectionism. It was pattern recognition built through repetition, the same cognitive process that made a master craftsman able to see in a single look what an apprentice could not find after 5 minutes of searching. You had put in the repetitions. The pattern lived in you. What made this skill the one the others were in service of was that none of the others functioned without it. Hand sewing required knowing the garment well enough to notice where it needed repair before the damage extended past what the skill could address. Darning required catching the heel before the hole, noticing the thin place while it was still a thin place rather than a gap. Canning required knowing the season, knowing what was ripening and when, knowing what the pantry held and what it was running short of before the running short became a problem. Budgeting required knowing the week's needs before the week began. Telephone etiquette required reading the call correctly in the first few seconds. Babysitting required reading the child before the child's situation became a crisis. Every skill on this list was activated by the underlying ability to notice what the moment required, which was a skill in itself, and the one that could not be learned in isolation from all the others. It came from practice, and practice came from responsibility, and responsibility was what a girl in a 1950s household carried earlier, and in larger portions than any equivalent arrangement would assign today. The household as a system was a specific kind of knowledge. It was knowledge of patterns and rhythms, and the places where patterns broke down, knowledge that accumulated through daily proximity and daily participation in maintaining the system's function. A girl who had contributed to the household's functioning since she was old enough to snap beans and fold laundry and set the table and answer the phone, carried a model of the household's workings in her body, the same way she carried the thimble's weight on her middle finger, or the resistance of the iron against the collar of a shirt. The knowledge was not verbal. It did not live in a list of rules. It lived in the hands and in the eyes, and in the particular quality of attention that years of caring for something produces in the person who does the caring. By the time you were 12, the house ran partly on your attention whether or not anyone had articulated that fact. The beds got made because you made them. The table got set because you set it. The message got written on the pad because you took it down correctly. The sweater dried flat because you knew it had to. The jam sealed because you followed the steps in order. The hem held because you caught it before it gave. None of this was celebrated in the way that a school achievement was celebrated, because a household that runs correctly produces no visible event, no graduation, no grade. It produces only continuity, the quiet fact of things being as they should be on Tuesday and on Wednesday and on the Tuesday after that, which is the most demanding standard any skill can be held to, and the one nobody ever tells you is impressive because it is simply expected. You carry it still. Not all of it, not in the same form, not with the same materials or the same weekly schedule or the same particular urgency, but the part that is really the skill, the habit of noticing what needs doing before it needs doing, the willingness to do it without being asked, the knowledge that maintaining something is a different kind of work than fixing something, and a more efficient one. That part travels. It traveled from the household where you learned it, into every household you have ever been responsible for since, and it will continue to travel. 18 skills. One house, the same hands. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.